So it now gives me great pleasure to introduce the leader of this effort, the visionary of this effort, the man who really helped push all of us forward in bringing this process, in developing these reports, in creating these strategies for the people of Providence. It gives me great pleasure and honor to introduce our mayor, Jorge Elorza.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Keith. Keith has been a thought partner in this work from the very, very beginning, as it was a seed just beginning to germinate. And he's been a leader as a member of the community, as part of the research team, and as a member of my team in City Hall in getting this going. So we owe you a huge debt of gratitude, Keith. Thank you for all the work and the thought leadership that you provided throughout this project. So today we're announcing two separate things. We're announcing the framework for reconciliation that has been developed by Ray and the team at Roger Williams in conjunction with members of the community. And we're also here to sign an executive order creating a reparations committee. So we'll take those two in order, but they are steps along the same process. In fact, they work together very seamlessly. So those are the two things, and there are a lot of people to thank and a lot of people to recognize for getting us to this point. And so I want to recognize Shondell Bernie Speaks, our MC for this morning, whom you've heard from. And I mentioned Ray and his leadership as part of the Providence Cultural Equity Initiative. I want to also recognize Brian Hendrickson from Roger Williams University, who's a partner on this project. And perhaps most importantly, and a spirit to all of this work, I want to recognize Cheryl Taylor. She's a Providence resident and a member of the community. And so much of this work has been driven by the community. In fact, perhaps the most radical idea that we have adopted throughout all of this is to center Black voices. Voices that have been excluded and marginalized for a very long time. What we've done is we've actually positioned them right in the center of these conversations so that the Black community can lead these conversations. It started over 2 years ago when we created the African American Advisory Group. And I'm pretty sure that Pastor Howard Jenkins was part of that first meeting. It was a meeting that brought together leaders of the Black community to help us discuss with the goal of overcoming the disproportionate impact that COVID was having in our neighborhoods. But soon we realized that it wasn't just a phenomenon that arose with COVID. Of course, there were longer, deeper structural issues that were causing that disproportionate impact. And so from the very beginning, we committed to going into and leaning into those conversations. So over the past 2 years, virtually every single week, I have met with a group of leaders, sometimes as many of over 100 people on the calls, and to discuss these issues. And there are a number of ideas, there are a number of policies, there's a number of initiatives that have come from this work. And one of them was the launch of the Truth, Reconciliation, and Reparations process that brings us here today. So it's been said that there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. For our country and our community, examining the centuries of injustice committed against African heritage and indigenous people, and reconciling those truths is long overdue. 2 years ago, when our country and the world witnessed the horrific murder of George Floyd, there were a number of folks who, talked the talk about racial justice. Here in the city, we wanted to show our commitment to this work as well, but we also committed to doing the work. That's what led to the creation or the deeper investment in the African American Ambassador Group, and it's what led to this initiative here. We want to do it right. We want to elevate the voices of our Black, indigenous, and communities of color, and we also want to do it deep. What we've learned is the wounds run deep, and so the solutions can't just be surface level. The solutions also have to run deep. And so we launched this process with a truth-telling report, working with researchers and led by Keith Stokes. And we produced a 200-page report outlining 400 years of history of treatment of BIPOC communities here in Providence and throughout the state. And I want to re-emphasize the point that Keith just made. This isn't a report that simply highlighted wrongs that were committed 400 years ago, but rather it showed how each of these injustices over time built upon each other, and the injustices have been perpetrated on our community as recently as the past several years, just as much as we see in the distant past. And so after we launched that, we produced the report, we launched the reconciliation phase. We don't want that report to sit on a shelf. And more specifically, we want to bring the stories to life. There are actual people in our community and in our neighborhood that have been impacted about some of these racial injustices and structural racism over time. And we wanted to make their voices heard, their faces seen, and their stories told. And I'll defer to Ray and his team in just a second as they go into greater detail as to how exactly they did that and how exactly that work needs to continue. So this framework that they'll be speaking about was deeply community driven. Again, the Providence Cultural Equity Initiative, the Roger Williams University, the Providence Public Library participated, and many members of the AAAG Truth Telling and Reconciliation subgroup, all participating and bringing us to this point. The framework for reconciliation was piloted in the neighborhoods of Fox Point, Lippet Hill, Upper South Providence, and West Elmwood. The same neighborhoods that Keith Stokes just talked about were the biggest targets of some of the most terrible racial injustices in our past. This framework also outlines a model and a proof of concept to continue this reconciliation work in perpetuity. Because reconciliation, as we've seen in other countries that have gone through this, is about bringing our community together. And the great irony here is that what we're telling the broader community is that you need not be afraid of the conversation around race. So often it's painted as an inherently divisive conversation, but it doesn't have to be that way. And we know because we've seen it in other countries. They've actually addressed them directly, and the communities have come together. We believe that is a model that has not only worked, but will work here in Providence. So last but not least, we wanted to make sure that we made the point that history is not just a thing of the past, but something that actively shapes the present. And there are real lives whose stories need to be told, need to be cataloged, and need to be included. So with all that, I'd like to pause, and I'd like to hand it over to our partners who are going to tell us about this important work around this framework of reconciliation that they've been working so hard in putting together, and I'm just so thankful to them for having brought us to this point. So I will step aside for a second, and we'll hear a great deal more about the reconciliation process.